Hello. Good morning. We're ready to start. A warm welcome to you all to the 10th Annual Cashel Conference here in Brú Cultural Centre. On behalf of the Cashel Conference team, I wish to express gratitude to all the contributors and guests here today who have travelled from near and far to participate in the 10th International Annual Conference, sharing compassion, international collaboration, fostering hope in clinical practice. In celebration of 10 years of collaboration, we are also launching a book in honour of this achievement later this afternoon. A céad míle fáilte to our guest speakers and contributors from Scotland, England, Europe, United States, and the South Seas, and our own native land. I wish to express apologies from Chrissy McGinn and Richard Hewitt, Patrick Anthony Hederman, and Dr. Robin Youngson, who could not be with us today due to unexpected circumstances, but who are with us in spirit. Deep gratitude, as always, to Bridget Delaney, our conference coordinator, and loyal St. Patrick Hospital advocates, who consistently support the conference and the work of the Compassionate Network. I wish to thank Joan Brosnan, Interim Director of Nursing at St. Patrick's Hospital, and her management team. We thank our sponsors, NMPDU, who have greatly eased the burden and endeavour of fundraising in recent years, so that this annual conference can be offered to all. Without the support of NMPDU, we might not have made this 10th anniversary conference. So thank you, Judy Ryan, NMPDU South East. And we acknowledge Judy's predecessor, Mark White, who is now Vice President of Research in WIT. As always, our deep gratitude and admiration go to Mary Prendergast, who initiated and fostered the significant development of compassionate networks and awareness, and who gracefully hosts this conference each year. I would like to invite you to join and share with us in a moment of compassionate silence in honour of Bernard Prendergast, Mary's beloved husband and life partner, who passed away unexpectedly last month. We extend our heartfelt sympathy and condolences to Mary, her son Michael, and her daughter Ella, their extended family, friends and community, who all bear this heavy loss. Arashde go Rivananam. We remember also those amongst us who have lost beloved parents and other dear friends and loved ones recently. May they rest in peace. We are here today to share in our knowledge and knowing of compassion. We are here in connection with one another and the services and worlds we each represent. We bring with us the richness and value of relationships within our workplace and in our private, personal lives, which nourish us and are mutually supportive. Compassion is an experience, an exchange of energy in its giving and its receiving. We are particularly good in health services at grasping words or phrases which represent the current pinnacle of what we deem to be a quality marker or a star rating for our services. 10 years ago, it was patient empowerment. The term patient empowerment adorned many strategies, policies, national policies, local policies, cited in academic works and studies. We did it to death, with marginal effect on the real patient empowerment, which in Ireland we have had far too much evidence of in recent years, the latest being the cervical screening scandal. We hollowed out the potential and the value. We need to know that patient forums and complaint systems can have little value if nothing changes in the hearts and minds and processes of those who are the system, i.e., we who serve. We cannot allow compassion as a value, an integral element of authentic service, to be hollowed out in the same manner. It is more than a statement in the headers and footers of organisational correspondence and emails and communications. We need research. We need research which does not posit entirely in certainties, as compassion is an energy, a connection, which flows and resides in the uncertain and is most needed in times of uncertainty. Compassion is the gossamer web which holds the unseen until we sense it and feel its presence when we are in our pain or when we witness the pain of others. Transpersonal research methods and intuitive inquiry are increasingly contributing to the body of knowledge in many important areas of personal service, personal experience, which we can then help inform us as we design and manage services into the future. And how do we know, really, how to provide compassionate services? Nelson Mandela tells us you cannot know a country if you have not been in its jails. Perhaps we cannot fully know our health services until we have been a service user or someone close to us has been. Each experience is unique. We are unique human beings, regardless of roles, and we bring our unique fears and concerns as both service users and service providers to all encounters and situations. The biggest fear which gets in the way of true and meaningful connection and relationship is the fear of being seen. Being fully seen, all the good and not so good parts, being seen in our fullness or fragility. Allowing our strengths to be seen is pretty easy, but revealing or allowing our vulnerability to be seen often drives a deep sense of shame within many of us. Failing to acknowledge our own vulnerability affects relationships, and in the workplace, this can lead to cliques and unnecessary tensions, which absorb energy which might best be channeled into creative and fulfilling service. Workplaces can be difficult, very difficult, and research tells us that the system wears us down. We who enter the healthcare world with the powerful intention to help others become overwhelmed and burnt out and functioning in the survival mode, feeling overworked and certainly undervalued. Working in failing systems requires a new response from us if we are to survive and improve our services. Meg Wheatley, who is my hero, and you'll hear a lot from her, tells us that in organisations, real power and energy is generated through relationships. The patterns of relationships and the capacities to form them are more important than tasks, functions, roles, and positions. Accepting our vulnerability and being compassionate and loving towards ourselves helps us to form better relationships and might help us to move into the warrior role within our respective failing systems. Buddha tells us that you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. So let's try to fully embrace self-compassion. Wheatley again tells us that the two skills of the warrior are compassion and insight. Compassion is easy, she tells us. It arises spontaneously from an open heart. Insight or discernment requires more skill. We have to choose our battles. And I think all of us know that within the workplace and when we try to lead change, drive change, or stop some certain changes. Everybody needs just a little kindness. It doesn't have to be complicated, we're told by Dalai Lama. There is no need for temples, no need for complicated philosophies. My brain and my heart are my temples, and my philosophy is kindness. We must act on hopes if we are to effect change. So we have a choice. We can choose our way of being each day. We can choose to express loving touch, kindness, gratitude, self-compassion, appreciation, mindfulness, and caring. Moving from surviving to thriving in complex working environments requires us to have and to be in community. to claim our roles as warriors of the human spirit. Wheatley claims that warriors of the human spirit are beings who choose not to flee, they abide. They serve as beacons of the story that tells of the goodness and generosity and creativity of humanity. You can identify them by their cheerfulness. You will know them by their compassionate presence. When asked how they do it, they will tell you about discipline, dedication, and the necessity of community. Hope is a key theme of this conference, and hope requires associated action, or change cannot happen. In the words of Martin Luther King, we must accept finite disappointment, but never, ever lose infinite hope. The natural flights of the human mind are not from pleasure to pleasure, but from hope to hope. We can look to the majestic Skelligs as they rise up sharply from the wild Atlantic Ocean and marvel at the Skellig Michael Monastery and the tenacity of those men who dared to dream, to build, to reside, and survive in such a hostile environment in order to serve in their own way. What hopes do they have, we wonder? Is it possible that the realization of their hopes in the 8th century stand as a reminder to us that where there is a will, there is a way? As each day dawns, let us choose our way of being to match the path we map for ourselves and those we serve. Thank you for listening. I'd like to introduce our chair for this morning, James O'Shea. Jim O'Shea tells me to call him. And he's Director of Regional Centre of Nursing and Midwifery Education in the South East. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Antoinette. Thanks, Antoinette. Yeah, I was just, as you were speaking, and as you mentioned, I suppose our experience of care and our experience of compassionate care, I was just having a little, a very quick, brief trip down memory lane. I remember many years ago, probably about 25 years ago, I was having a procedure in one of the Dublin hospitals that required sedation. But because I had to drive, I couldn't have the sedation. So in the little mini theatre were myself, a couple of nurses, the consultant, and a porter. And I was terrified, of course. I was terrified by the unknown. I was terrified that it was going to hurt, and probably terrified of lots of other things as well. And as the procedure happened, I remember noticing that obviously the consultant was focused on the job at hand, and I'm kind of glad he was. And the two nurses were fussing to make sure I was all right. And I'd say my heart must have been going at about 150 beats a minute at that stage. And the porter grabbed my hand and he said, "You'll be all right, son." And I suppose for me, that was probably one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had of compassionate care. The professionals were very busy fussing around me, but that man copped that I needed something different and I needed something more. And it's probably the one thing that always comes back to my mind when we reflect on compassionate care. I'm delighted to be here again. I closed the conference last year, and my closing, I suppose, had a lot of questions. And in the closing, I asked myself a lot of questions. And I suppose in the years since, talking to Mary and seeing this wonderful book, this wonderful publication, I'm glad to say a lot of those questions have been answered. I'm certain that as we proceed today, we will generate a lot more questions for ourselves. And I suppose, to my mind, any kind of learning interaction should really be about questions more than answers. It's about the questions we ask, and it's about the reflective space that brings us into. So I'm really looking forward to that, being in that reflective space with all of you guys today. And by way of starting us off, our first presentation is called Crossing the Atlantic, Completing the Cycle of Compassion in Nursing. And our first speaker is Professor Sarah Kagan, and I understand that it's a joint, or has been a joint initiative with Professor Dana Walroth. And of course, it's manna from heaven for the chairperson when the speaker says I'll introduce myself. So Dana's going to introduce herself. So thank you, Dana.
Good morning, everyone. And I'm just going to pull up our slides here. How are you all? Yeah, that's us. But what you really want are, you will soon see our collaboration, because I can't click on the right thing first thing in the morning. There we are. So with that, then, we say good morning. I'm Sarah Kagan, and
I'm Dana Walrath.
And we are really pleased to offer you an unusual talk, what we hope will be a truly unusual talk. This is our contribution to a celebration today of a wonderful book, a wonderful gathering. And our aim is to represent and extend the chapter we contributed to sharing compassion. Our joint personal hope, though, is a little bit different. But first, before we show you our sort of way of doing this, we do want to offer our gratitude and our greetings. We bring you most joyful greetings. Dana and I came to collaborate through a very unexpected journey that I'll share in a moment, but it's worth noting that we carry intertwined intellectual and existential ties across the Atlantic Ocean to you. The hospital, Pennsylvania Hospital, where I practice, is actually the place where Dana gave birth, not once but twice. And it's America's oldest hospital. And so we pictured it here alongside this sacred place, the Rock of Cashel, as a way of helping you to think about images that allow us to really appreciate the importance of entwined history, journey, and labor of all sorts in revealing the hidden elements in the contemplation and realization of compassion. I do want to say special gratitude, Mary, to you for making this day possible. I know that my life would have been immeasurably different had you not invited me here 5 years ago and allowed me to suggest that Dana join us last year. So thank you for that. Bridget, we couldn't do it without you. I wish you ran every organization and hospital in America. American healthcare would succeed in that way. And thank you to each of you for being here. Our sense of being grateful, I think, spans the wide Atlantic. It's that big. I also want to say I'm incredibly grateful and thankful for the chance to be here with Dana. As a nurse and a teacher and a social scientist, I never imagined offering a talk which would be a true collaboration in words and art. And I think you'll see that over the next 25 minutes or so. But here I am, and I am the words to the art of an anthropologist, artist, and novelist. A bit like music and lyrics, though I don't think we're as hummable as Rodgers and Hammerstein or other great collaborations. We hope that you enjoy it nonetheless. And as we think about this, our story is an odd one. Dana and I met serendipitously in Armenia. That's the little colored bit of the map. It is a small former Soviet republic in the South Caucasus, and it's, of all places in the world to meet, half a world away from where we started out. We both have strong links to the University of Pennsylvania, where Dana did her PhD in anthropology, and I am faculty in nursing. But we first encountered each other so far away. In an office we shared for a couple of weeks, our intellectual interests just clicked as we explored the plight of destitute elders and other socially marginalized groups in Armenia. And it was in a shared office that Dana, while we were doing a joint tutorial, called out the essential anthropologic concepts of social birth and social death. Dana showed our students in public health, rather than really teaching, saying, we all know about the biological notions of birth and death, emergence from the womb, that final beat of the heart, or that final breath. But each culture has its own definition for when life truly begins and truly ends, for when personhood is conferred or taken away. Today, we'll draw out on those concepts, particularly of social death, but also of birth, the birth of compassion and connections to other facets of our humanity, and of joy, the joy of expressing and recognizing compassion in ourselves and in one another. All of this acknowledgement is heart and soul felt. And it brings Dana and me to reflect to you that in a way, the true title of this talk is Parallel Loss, Grief Understood, Shared Vulnerabilities as Life Lived, and the Key to Care. This last year brought many changes for each of us, and likely for many of you too. We have endured losses, suffered grief, and found solace in people, space, and time. Sorry, it's a hard one. But I'm incredibly joyful to be here with you and to talk about the story that lies behind the difference in the titles of Life and Loss, Death and Intersections. The chapter we wrote together is really about the thought and the writing generated when I returned here to Cashel, now 5 years running, for our shared day of compassion, contemplation, and connection. Dana spoke at the conference last year and made an impression on all of us, even to the extent that she's now living in Dublin for the year. Yes, you can connect with her personally. I'll tell you something about that at the very end. And serendipitously, I think for me, Dana's presence last year crystallized the place and importance of the aesthetic in considering compassion. I wrote about it in one of an ongoing cycle of essays resulting from my participation here. That essay then prompted me to ask Dana to comment on the chapter I wrote for the book, and she did so by creating this title illustration that you see here, that we're going to go through kind of piece by piece in a way. And each of our lives in the past year, really in a span of a blink of an eye existentially, but in a very long year, changed quite greatly. Dana's mother, Alice, died shortly after the conference, leaving Dana to fly home from the UK, where she was speaking just after our conference here, in time to arrive at Alice's bedside for her death. My mother died in April, and as we go on now, I hope to speak to, and Dana clearly draws deeper dimensions of our losses and the insight and illumination we gained in sharing our grief, generating central elements of what we felt necessary to share with you today. So in this sacred space, as we look up the hill, we are liberated to ponder many essential elements of being human, feeling compassion, and giving care. We present this talk in honor of our mothers. So for the two of us, this wonderful place allows us to pause, to breathe, and to absorb. The deaths of our mothers, so inspirational to each of us in different ways, shape new awarenesses of the place of loss and grief in creating layers of vulnerability that are linked to and are the wellspring of compassion. The shared vulnerability and time spent being with our mothers at their deaths generated a moment of true realization in each of us in relation to the nature of compassion and embodiment of it in care. Dana's mother, Alice, lived for many years with dementia. At first, she lived on her own, as so many people do. Just after her husband died, she had probably had him supporting her. Dementia, of course, is stealthy. It creeps up, disordering the day, putting life in disarray. Alice eventually moved in with Dana, a state of living day to day that Dana portrays so humorously and elegantly and honestly. Life with Alice was by turns funny and charming and downright painful. Alice outgrew life with her daughter as dementia generated bigger and bigger holes. Beautiful comfort lay in a sheltered space of residential care in the New England state of Vermont. To take you there, let me read a transcendent passage from Dana's essay, Final Desserts. Alice eats, using a spoon today. Beside her, I deadhead potted veronica and petunias. What are you doing? Taking off the dead blossoms so that the plant will make new ones. The things we learn from plants. Forgetting to swallow, Alice has packed her mouth squirrel-like. Swallow, I remind her, snapping off a live blossom and tucking it behind her ear. Here, have some water. Dementia also makes swallowing hard to coordinate. We could bring her mush and thickened liquids to get around this, but the kitchen staff dotes on her, and she consumes their Vermont farm-to-table fare with gusto. Alice is still working on peach cobbler with fresh whipped cream when Henry comes out to join us. I wipe some stray whipped cream off of Alice's cheek with the edge of the spoon. Henry beams at Alice, his right hand tapping his heart. "You're beautiful." To me, he says, "We may have to elope." Alice blots her lips. She sips water from her plastic mug, her pinky ever graceful extended. But the water goes down the wrong way, and she starts choking. I rise to stand close to her, stroking her back, her guide, her would-be Charon, her eyes magnet-like on mine. She clutches my other hand and forces out 4 sticky, long-ago words, intelligible only to me. "Call 911. It's okay, just breathe." I tell Alice, Henry, the doll, myself. We've talked about it. We've planned on dying someday, she and I. It's okay, it will be okay. There's peach cobbler, fresh whipped cream, and poetry in heaven. We wear flowers tucked behind our ears there. Alice died shortly after Dana arrived home, having received the call that all of us as grown children, caring for aged parents at a distance, fear, imagine, replay, when that time has passed and the call was only an opening to say goodbye for the last time. Dana welcomed family after Alice's death. In the hours that came after her physical death, to say their goodbyes, all making a small contribution to Alice's departure from this life and the cremation that she chose. What for them is their family tradition, old or new, is that which creates Alice's departure, her social death. My mom, Nancy, died this past April. Her death looked idyllic from the hospice nurse's perspective. For us, it was just me and Mom doing together what she wished. I arrived hours after she enrolled in home hospice, and well, as you can guess, I don't feel strong enough to share a lot of details, even in this kind group. Know that Mom was very decisive. For her, death was death. It was a nothing, a departure of mind and body with nothing after. She decided on death one day, enrolled in hospice the next, and went from being independent on one weekend to her death at home in her own bed, just as she wished, 10 days later. She left this world having given me her ultimate directive, bossy to the end, go and teach in Hong Kong, just as I do usually each spring. And this time I went with an entire new wardrobe. A new dress each day, Mom? I was a bit bug-eyed at the thought, I'll admit. Yes, each day. There was no arguing with her. I did exactly as she demanded. It wasn't a suggestion at all. It was a directive. And very simply, Mom was cremated, an act that I arranged the day after the evening on which she died. And it was over and yet not. Simple, yet not simple at all. In the end, though, it was exactly and all that Mom had wished. It was our time together on the inside, and it was a good death seen from the outside. No crisis or disruption, just our compassion and vulnerability braided together in empathy as I sought to ensure that Mom's dignity would be upheld to be the person I knew her to be. So, with that breath, I'd like you to think about then what Dana and I bring as we tell you about this chapter. It synthesizes a cycle of essays that I've written about compassion as a response to participating in this conference now for this is my 5th year. That work was unplanned and organically generated a model of compassion that I address specifically to nurses working in hospitals, and especially in acute high-intensity wards and intensive care wards. Though I will say, I've had calls from lay health advocates and other healthcare professionals who've really enjoyed and found parts of the cycle specifically useful or interesting to them. Dana represents the cycle for you here. The foundation is this complex notion of vulnerability in the center. It allows for revolution of empathy, leading to compassion, which promotes dignity, that in turn supports personhood. It is in this cycle of compassion that I've been able to realize my desire to move past what I believe is the oxymoron of compassionate care. I've always said, it isn't care if compassion is absent. It's just a procedure done to someone. It's just a bath or some other event, not compassion. And it helps me to talk about, to reveal that compassion is never, in a human sense, existing in isolation of other emotion or of other beings, and that is why vulnerability lies at the roots of the model. I'd written many times about how centrally vulnerability grounds expression of compassion as our work in nursing and other caregiving professions must advance. But this past year, and particularly through my relationship and collaboration with Dana, I've been able to sharpen and deepen the power of vulnerability in my speaking and my writing, and I think it's done the same for Dana, so we'd like to explain just a little bit more. So we can walk back across the waves of the Atlantic. You can come with me on my journey in retrospect so that I can show you how flying back and forth to County Tipperary, starting in 2013, all of this came together. I began simply with a nun, that's N-O-N-E. As with Dana's incredible images here from Alzheimer's about her mother Alice's life with dementia, I reflected in the first talk that I gave here that American nurses were not writing about compassion. We wrote and still write about the absence of compassion, which we see as compassion fatigue. We also now write about the product of compassion, if compassion can produce a commodity, which we call compassion satisfaction. But American nurses do not write about compassion. We likely think about it quite a bit, and we certainly expect it, often to the extent of taking it for granted. So all of these sort of thoughts came together in a simple essay called Compassion. In 2015, though, I got a bit more sophisticated. I published 2 essays in this literary cycle, published in Geriatric Nursing, an American nursing journal. One on empathy and the other exploring dignity. They were born of the intersection of my personal life, immersed as I was at the time in long-distance care for my mom, and in my second visit to Cashel. I responded, having been here in Cashel, and I'll take you back to that point by asking you to reflect on why and how you are who you are in care. What is it that sustains you in the work that you do emotionally and spiritually? I'll wager the story you'd tell is about a true and deep interest in people and a profound compassion for those people, their health, and the trials of their daily lives. So in these essays, then, I began to put forward the idea that I really believe there's a difference between the compassion expressed by caring professionals in practice as compared with simple human compassion. Our feelings of empathy and compassion are shared by others. Our actions are not. They are depending on us for something different. And Jim, you noticed this when the porter reached out to you and gave you what you needed. We need to deliver that. So our actions then must take shape in ways that many do not immediately see as compassion or see as not terribly central. But we do what we do with compassion and a larger sense of preservation of dignity and of the person. Our patient's dignity requires that our shared personhood supersede our temporary roles of nurse and patient, while our embodiment frames interaction in professional compassion. This work then made solid my investment in vulnerability and nursing. Mom had a second hip replacement about this time and became delirious after the operation. We really suffered her delirium together. But Mom rebounded quickly, and I always wondered, was it the essential oil of lavender that I was sprinkling on her pillow and drew every nurse into the room saying, "Oh, it smells so wonderful"? She awoke to say, "The nurses really make things work here." She was the daughter of a physician and a nurse. Dana's image here, Lakura, lacunae, sings to me of beauty found in the gaps, the spaces left by lost capacity, by illness. Mom took a direct blow with her delirium, but in it there was true epiphany for each of us. So I came to write then directly about vulnerability in 2016, thinking about it in a way that is captured so beautifully by Dana's image here. I was conscious of intertwined personal and professional ideals and actions that led me to take this deep dive into vulnerability. Woman, daughter, nurse, caregiver. In that first talk here in Cashel, and for those of you who are here, you might remember, I asked everyone attending, how many of you are patients? And I recall only the inimitable poet and philosopher Sean Brophy raised his hand. He was the only one in the room. I now encourage every clinician I meet to realize we're all patients. We're all patients at various points in our lives. Jim, you illustrated that for us just this morning. Realizing the duality of patient and clinician, care recipient and caregiver, now anchors my cycle of compassion. Perceiving the state of vulnerability as exclusively negative defies a universal human truth. We are all vulnerable in varied ways and at different times of our lives. To be vulnerable, then, is to be fully human. My own losses spanning the past 2 years, listening to those of others, including Dana's loss of Alice, makes me ever more certain that the beauty she portrays here in the holes that dementia creates, the absences, and this is again about Alzheimer's disease, is a similarly powerful human truth. 2017 brought me back to dignity with far more explicit intent to surface personhood and strength. Both my professional practice and in my life, I was now thinking about my mom and a new diagnosis she had of a virulent breast cancer. The experience showed me how dignity, situated in the context of an acute or intensive care unit particularly, commonly implies that the patient need only be clean, dressed, and nourished to have dignity. The nature of comfort, human comfort, is too often lost within biomedical analysis of dignity. Comfort, though, is really a nuanced personal sense of ease and of familiarity that is emotional, social, and spiritual as much as it is physical. The reality of making the personal possible in healthcare today is paradoxically truly difficult, bringing into question the place of comfort and of dignity. Almost always, we do not see the special powers, the personal that makes the person whole and comfortable, like Alice, pictured here, might possess. Instead, we see only problems. Alice, Mom, everyone who's ever been in a situation that my mom faced when seeing her breast surgeon for the first time are those whom I championed in my second essay that year. When meeting her breast surgeon, who was also named Nancy, Mom had to hear one of those most puzzling compliments, comb put-downs I've ever encountered. "You look way better than your problem list," said Surgeon Nancy to patient Nancy with a smile, and it really was a genuine smile. And we both just stopped. Look, every person, no matter how frail or ill, possesses strengths and resources that may offset particular disadvantages or be leveraged to mitigate specific problems. To be seen as nothing more or less than a list of problems lies at the heart of the depersonalizing of modern medicine. I conceived the advantage list as nursing's antidote to the medical problem list. A problem list leads really only to failure or to restoration of a hitherto undefined status quo, a none, N-O-N-E, much like the none of compassion with which I began this journey across the Atlantic. This year, my essays in this cycle of compassion speak to education and respect. One of Dana's Alzheimer's comics that you see here fits, as does her reminder, and I quote, "And remember that by showing the faces and daily reality of those with Alzheimer's and other different ways of being, we remove stigma and restore humanity. Comics let us see the world through the eyes of others, those who are hurting, to feel their stories and to remember our own and to heal." I've long held that the individual is a patient only for a moment, but their own self, a person forever. Last year here in Cashel, Dana showed us an image that sticks with me in my mind. You might remember it as well. Reading a graphic novel. And Dana's description of that moment with her mother just riveted me. A woman living with advanced dementia, carefully turning the pages of a novel and then talking with her daughter about an idea from the book greatly impressed me. I realized as I looked at this remarkable photo, making the art of our art and science more palpable generates new potential. So often, efforts made in healthcare to educate the patient, the consumer, do not educate and do not respect. These efforts are merely motions gone through to tick the box, to exert power through discharged obligations. In my second essay this year, I posit that nurses must reconcile the diminishment of common respect for elders, which too often strips power and agency in the name of help and support, with our professional obligations. Identifying the nature of respect in obedience or deference, and in putting that together in the care of contemporary evidence-based healthcare is far trickier than it might first appear. Notions of being obedient or deferent as a measure of our respect for them do not align with professional compassion, as I see it at least. We must amend the perceived duty to defer, leveraging our roles as experts in helping patients and their families achieve necessary transitions far beyond the hospital. We must shift our perspectives in order to lead social change. Compassion and respect for our elders and youngers, too, must move from kind interactions to respectful and professional application of evidence in compassionate practice. To do so is to realize that when care lacks professional compassion, it is not care at all. So then, if we limit our care to the confines of the problem list, it is, again, not care in any sense of the word. Dana reveals a heart-lifting hope when she says, and we're looking here at the comic called Alice's Night Flight, "I dream that stories will become integral to healthcare encounters. The diagnosis will be accompanied by support for those finding hidden gifts, for using magic, for rehearsing, for letting go of ego and of our old social roles, of ego and old social roles." Yes, we are all human beings, and as givers of care, those acts of being with that are laden with compassion face ego and must shrug off old social roles, embracing a present filled with dangers and hoping for a future comforting and safe. In crossing the Atlantic, I found my philosophy of compassion in nursing, bringing forward to cognition what had previously only been spiritual and aesthetic. I found in that a place where empathy emerges from vulnerability, empathy then grounds compassion, compassion fosters dignity for both actors, in my case, for patient and nurse, which in turn bolster personhood for everyone. Caring for my mom during her days on hospice taught me so much more than I could ever have imagined about the centrality of vulnerability in making real a greater compassion. Much of it was in the negative space of not, the none. Not being hospitalized, not having others provide care when she wasn't comfortable having them provide care to her, not living discord over conflicting understandings or discordant wishes. Mom and I had a lot of not that made our time together as much relief and joy as it was poignancy. I fully acknowledge that I really, because of Mom, were really lucky. We relaxed into what most caring professionals see as the archetypal good death. Good or not, it was ours. It was Mom's. But in all that we had, I got to see that with which others contend and that others may not have. I took the risk of being so vulnerable with Mom that I reaped an awareness of a vulnerability that freed me. It freed me to imagine what it would be to be a better nurse, a more fully caring professional, if you will. And now Dana and I come here to a close. We return to a new version of this beautiful and meaningful image that Dana created for the chapter, for the book we're celebrating here today, that began our collaboration. In it, she's highlighted the flow of compassion. Thank you, Annette, for reminding us, Antoinette, of the flow of compassion. The flow of compassion back to the heart of vulnerability. And you'll notice there's no mind in this image. It is of the heart of vulnerability. And I think that this particular way of seeing this drawing reminds me of how essential that flow truly is, both within ourselves and between one another. We sincerely hope that in our short time with you today, we've generated new waves of compassion in all our hearts. We thank you so much for your kind attention. We're truly grateful for it. And I'll just leave you with this different version of the image, and I'd like to let you know that Dana's speaking next week at an exciting event, I wish I could stay for it, at the National Gallery in Dublin on arts and dementia. She'll be there on Thursday, and we have brochures, so at the Meet the Author session, we'll share a bit more with you about that. So again, we end with our grateful thanks and for gratitude in your presence. Take care.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Dana, for that wonderful, wonderful, creative presentation. As you were speaking, I was jotting down a few notes in terms of just what was coming to me, and these are some of the things that just briefly came to me during your presentation. I really was struck by that notion, I suppose, of an embodied experience of compassion rather than it simply being an intellectual concept. I also had a sense of the sacred space, particularly in your grief and in your loss, and the healing wonder and the wonderful healing of compassion. Also had a sense that you talk about freedom and autonomy and the right to go our own way, and how challenging that can be for us as professionals to allow people to go their own way, to make their own choices. I also love the way you embrace the creative, and I remember from last year, Dana, when you spoke about your man, when you spoke about your book, Alzheimer's, and I suppose the wonderful liberation that the creative brings for all of us in healthcare. Allows us maybe perhaps to what I would see as being able to live outside the box a little bit, or as Kim Foster says, to live outside the square. We're allowed to be a little bit more quirky and a little bit more bizarre. I'm a psychiatric nurse, so I'm allowed to do that anyway. But really, I suppose it really, one of the things that struck me most as your presentation went on was that real, I suppose, need for us to reach out from our own humanity. And that our compassion and our professional compassion is an extension and an evolution of our own sense of the core of human compassion. So thank you so much, both of you, for that wonderful presentation. Now, I need to get my act together and introduce our next speaker, who's Professor Wilf McSherry. And Wilf is a professor of nursing in a joint appointment between Staffordshire University and the University Hospitals of North Midlands NHS Trust, and is part-time professor at the University of Bergen in Norway. He's published several books and many articles addressing different aspects of the spiritual dimension. He's founding member and an executive member of the British Association for the Study of Spirituality, and he's currently leading a European project entitled Enhancing Nurses' Competence in Providing Spiritual Care. Thank you, Wilf.
I've got a script here, but I don't think I'm going to use it. It's I'll see how I go. Firstly, thank you. Thank you to Mary, Michael, Bridget, all the conference organisers for your hospitality, your generosity, for your compassion. And I know it's been a very difficult time, and I think it's down to your courage that this conference is still happening and still communicating a very important message in terms of the need for compassion. One area I've been interested in for a long time is the area of spirituality. Where does it fit? Does it have a place in terms of how we care for people, how we care for each other, how we care for society, how we care for our environment? So one of the things what I must point out as well is to thank my colleague Adam Bowie. I'm at a stage in my career now where I'm thinking about succession. How can we pass on the baton, that relay in terms of carrying this torch to generate further inspiration, to keep people continually engaging with these issues. So my colleague Adam Bowie, he's just taken up post as a lecturer in adult nursing. I've worked with Adam for a considerable number of years. So what I'm trying to do is to sustain the next generation. How can we nurture, how can we enable people to flourish? So Adam's made a significant contribution to this chapter, and some of his thinkings informed this presentation, so I acknowledge Adam as well. So the global challenge, weaving the warp and the weft of spirituality throughout care. I was just listening to Sarah and Dana and their presentation this morning, and the reference to the word spirituality or spiritual. I think I counted 5 or 6 times when that word was made reference to, either personally or professionally. And I think that gives some justification about why we need to weave this word throughout the tapestry of healthcare. So what I'm going to do is, or try and achieve, is the following. What I want to do is to revisit some contemporary definitions of spirituality. There's a big debate. What is spirituality? Is there a place for it within healthcare? If there is a place, who should be providing spiritual care? So what I'll try and do is untangle and demystify some of the meaning and the relevance for healthcare. And what I'll try and do is delineate the warp and the weft. What do we mean by these? What might constitute the warp and what might constitute the weft in terms of spirituality? And where does these concepts fit in terms of holistic, person-centred care? And how might we, in the provision of healthcare, in whichever context we're working, recognise this in the tapestry of people's lives? Then what I want to do is to try and pull some of this together and share a reflection. The story of James, who was receiving palliative and end-of-life care in the clinical area where I was working many years ago, early on in my career. Because I think still there are lessons, there are intuitions to be learned from that powerful story. So where do we start? I think the first thing we recognise is the complexity of healthcare. And when I reflect on my 30-plus years working as a nurse, as a practitioner, healthcare has changed immensely. And I would say on 99% of the occasions for the better. So I started my nursing career as an auxiliary nurse working on a psycho-geriatric ward for people, I wouldn't say living with dementia, they were existing with dementia at that time. And when I reflect on some of the practices I was exposed to as a teenager at 18 years of age, I would say now some of those will be outlawed in terms of a violation of people's humanity, their dignity, their personhood. So healthcare, the landscape of healthcare has changed immensely in those 20, 30 years. Far more complex, far more advanced, technologically, pharmacologically. We've got a whole host of professions that are working in an integrated, cohesive manner. And with the ultimate goal is about keeping the person at the centre of all this activity, this complexity. And I think that's a major challenge, because the more advanced we become, the more technical, the more expert, in brackets, bigger the danger for losing sight of the person and the people who are most important. And I think what I've really benefited over the last 24 hours is just sharing stories, listening to how issues we're facing in the United Kingdom in a complex healthcare system are very similar to areas in the US, the same challenges, the same difficulties, the same opportunity in terms of what we need to do. I had a meeting the other week with some senior colleagues in the trust where I'm working. And partway through this conversation, I gave them a question. I said, what is our unique selling point as nursing? What is it that we as a nursing profession bring to this complexity of care? And there was silence. none of those senior nurses who were present could articulate what is it that is unique about our contribution. So I'm on a mission at the minute, because if we can't articulate what it is we bring in terms of our professional identity, our role, the danger is we'll get a ton of bureaucrats, a ton of other, not in a derogatory sense, professions telling us this is what you need to do. So I've been setting students, first-year students, a challenge. Throughout the 3 years of your programme, I want you to identify what is it that we as a profession bring to compassionate care, and how can we safeguard it? How can we celebrate it? Because I think there's been too much devaluing. I remember being at the Royal College of Nursing Congress early on in my career, and the president for the RCN was stood at Congress opening the conference. And within minutes, there was hundreds of delegates. It was in Harrogate Conference Centre that year. Hundreds of delegates queuing down the aisles of this big conference centre. And what the president had kept on referring to was basic nursing. And what the delegates were challenging them was, there's nothing basic we do. It's fundamental. It's essential. And Sarah said last night, it's the core of what we do. I've never used the word basic since when I talk about nursing, when I talk about healthcare, because everything we do is fundamental. It has such a powerful impact. And we know when compassion is absent. We know when we're not being treated with dignity. We know when that spiritual element isn't part of this process of well, I wouldn't even use the word process, part of this interaction in terms of care delivery. So healthcare is complex, it's global, it's changing, it costs. And I think one of the things I've been doing latterly is reflecting on some of why are we constantly encountering situations where reports are being published that highlight some significant failings in care delivery around nursing, healthcare generally. And one of the things is, as soon as we start to put finances in front of people, as soon as we start to put other models of care delivery before the person, tragedy happens. And when I reflect on some of the cases that have happened recently in the United Kingdom, it's pretty clear that's what's happened. The sight has shifted from the person, the patient, the individual caregivers who are responsible, all the different professions, to pound signs and euro signs or whatever currency we're working in. Tragedy happens. And I think the danger for us as healthcare becomes more complex, more global, how we get that balance. Yeah, it costs, and we've got to fund it, and we've got to find the finances, and we've got to maintain budgets and work within certain parameters. But there are some key core elements that are, in my opinion, sacred to care delivery in terms of the impact. So I've been having a chuckle, well, not a chuckle to myself, but I've been having a bit of a debate. Myself and another colleague with the Nursing and Midwifery Council. So standard representation, we use the word holistic, we use the word person-centred, we use the word compassionate care. So I wrote a chapter a year ago in another book on dignity, stories of dignity in healthcare. And I started my chapter reflecting on buzzword straplines that preface the word care. And there's a whole range, and I filled a slide full of these straplines: compassionate care, dignity in care, spiritual care, evidence-based care. And I started to think, well, what do these words tell us? What do these buzzwords, these straplines tell us? And what they tell us is, this is about people. This is about relationships. This is about that encounter. It's about seeing the whole person, not just a test or a condition or a set of treatment that needs to be implemented. So it's this holistic model in terms of care delivery. Then when we look at models of care delivery, people often present a diagram like this. They'll present a pie chart or a circle, say it's the whole person, and then subdivide it into 4 key dimensions. But what's interesting, well, I'll get you to a bit of interaction at this time of the morning. Put your hand up if you think the word spiritual is an integral part of care delivery. right? So I feel comfortable here. I feel at home. Because sometimes when I ask that, there's hesitancy in terms of people's affirmation or confirmation of this place, of this word, this dimension of the person. So what was interesting, in 2014, the Nursing Midwifery Council in the United Kingdom revised its Code of Professional Practice. And there's been a hell of a lot of evidence-based care, research, highlighting the importance of the spiritual dimension to people's health, well-being, to that holistic dimension. So what was interesting, back towards the end of 2014, I'd led a large study for the Royal College of Nursing in 2010. And they contacted me in 2014 and said, would you review the code for us in light of the work you did on spirituality? So I reviewed it, sent a nice email back to them and saying the word spiritual is in a glossary in the back of this code. Well, interestingly, the glossary didn't even get into this code, neither did the word spiritual. Because one of my points to the RCM was the word spiritual is in this glossary. It needs to be placed in the body of this document. So the code fell through our letterboxes as registered nurses on the register. I think it was March 2015. Ran home that evening, looked at the place where I thought the word spiritual would be inserted, and this is what it read. Make sure that the people's physical, social, psychological needs are assessed and responded to. My heart sank. So myself and good friend, Professor Linda Ross from the University of Glamorgan, got together that evening and wrote a nice 4-page letter to the Chief Executive of the NMC, asking them on what decision and what basis, what evidence had they made the decision not to insert the word spiritual. Anyhow, it went quiet for a little while, as you can imagine. About a month later, it's sad when I carry these things around, isn't it? We got a 2-page letter back from the NMC detailing the rationale, the reasoning why the word spiritual hadn't been inserted. And the major reason was we didn't need to make reference to this explicitly because it was covered under human rights. That was the basic tenet of their argument. We're in dialogue. That's all I'm saying at the minute. We're in dialogue with the NMC because I feel this was a lost opportunity. And the reason why I'm saying this is because what's going to come shortly, it gives the wrong indication in terms of where does this concept, where does spirituality feature? How do we weave it as the warp and weft into the complexity of healthcare? So all I'm going to do is focus on this word spiritual for a little while. There's a wonderful book written by the late David Hay. And the reason why I think this is a tremendous book is David Hay was a zoologist, but he had a real interest in people's personal religious and spiritual belief, this sense of transcendence. And he wrote this book about the something there, about the spiritual dimension of the person. And what he says, it is therefore of great interest that in recent years a considerable body of evidence has been accumulating in both the physical and social sciences, suggesting that our spiritual nature is real and not illusionary. Or many of the people I have spoken with during my research put it, there is something there. And I think what David Hay is highlighting is this is part of our fabric, it's part of our DNA, it's part of our narrative as individuals, it's part of that warp and that weft which we all weave. But the question I have is if our professional regulatory bodies ignore or for whatever reason don't give due credence to this dimension, there's a danger. And the danger is this concept becomes marginal, it becomes neglected, it doesn't become engaged with. So the question then is, this might account for why are we failing in some areas to recognise the warp and the weft of spirituality. Because what happens, this leads to misconceptions. It leads to misconceptions about the meaning of this concept. It can perpetuate a view that spirituality is purely synonymous with religious belief. There's a lot of fear and anxiety, and I'm going to use a case in a minute. I can't go through all of these points, but I'll highlight a couple. People come up with a whole barrage of excuses, and some of them are legitimate. I'm not going to stand here and say, when I look at the issues we faced, the challenges in the NHS last year around capacity, around place, around time, it was horrendous in terms of people are busy, we're all busy, but we can use busyness and time as an excuse to engage. Lack of education and training, and then the issue of secularization in society. Who speaks loudest, who has the greatest voice, can lead to significant change, and that might not always be to the good. It can be to the detriment of others. So just to illustrate this, fear of proselytizing. So there's been 2 big cases in England around nurses who've been challenged for their personal religious belief and the appropriateness of that in terms of their professional practice. So the one on the right was Caroline Petrie. Caroline Petrie was a community nurse who was caring for an older lady one evening, left her home, and as she was leaving, she said to the lady, "Would you like me to pray for you?" And the lady didn't answer. But when the lady's main carer came home that evening, she communicated what this nurse had said. They phoned her employer, Caroline Petrie's, and she was suspended instantly for using. So the only reference to anything personal or professional in this code, in this document, is on page 15. Make sure you do not express your personal beliefs, including political, religious, or moral beliefs, to people in an inappropriate way. So Caroline Petrie was accused of using a professional role inappropriately to try and promote her own personal belief. Public outcry. Within a week, Caroline Petrie was reinstated. Part of the reason for the NMC, the Royal College of Nursing, doing the work on spirituality was in light of this case, because they were asked to comment. The nursing midwifery were asked to comment. The Department of Health were asked to comment. And what comment did they give? No comment. Silence. This recent case is a nurse, a Christian nurse, who was actually removed from the professional register for offering to pray with patients before surgery. So part of her assessment, operative assessment, was looking at people's, asking, do you have a personal religious or spiritual belief? And I think at part of that assessment, she'd seen this as an opportunity to promote their own religious belief and opinion. They were actually removed from the Nursing Midwifery Council's register. However, interestingly, I was meeting with one of my PhD students a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about this case, and they said, do you know that the person's been reinstated now after a period of removal, and I assume a period of reflection and education. But this highlights a lot of uncertainty, a lot of misconception about spirituality is just religion. There's a lot of fear about what is the demarcation between my personal belief and my professional practice. And this was certainly reflected in the qualitative comments provided by respondents to the RCN survey. Caroline Petrie's case was mentioned quite frequently. So what we did with the Royal College of Nursing was develop a pocket guide which highlighted some key steps that might need to be taken between the personal and the professional. And the first thing is about consent. Has this request for prayer been initiated by the person, by the patient? If it hasn't, don't go any further. Is there clear lines of consent? Is it within your scope of professional practice? Well, we'll struggle because there isn't much in here in terms of guidance, only condemnation. So this is perhaps one reason why this word spirituality isn't woven into the warp and the weft of healthcare. But what do we mean by this warp and the weft? And how do you and I weave these dimensions of spirituality? So we're going to be weavers for the next 20 minutes, 10 minutes. One proponent of spirituality is a lady called Ruth Stoll. She's probably one of the pioneers around this dimension in nursing and in healthcare. And she talks about this two-dimensional model. She talks about the vertical dimension, which we could call the warp. And this is to do with the person's transcendent things beyond ourselves, what David here would refer to as something there. It's about relationships and the possibility of person-relatedness to it. It might be, for some people, a belief in a God, but for others it might not be anything to do with anything religious. And then the horizontal reflects and fleshes out the supreme values or experiences of one's relationships, and that might be with God, or a deity. And it's about how people express their beliefs, their value, their lifestyle, quality of life. And it's about these interactions with ourselves, with others, and other aspects of nature, which might be part of this vertical dimension. So we've got the vertical and the horizontal. One's more to do with transcendence, this sense of something greater and beyond yourself, and the other one is more grounded in terms of relationship, nature, connection. And it fits into this model of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Somebody was saying, well, if you need to get shot of this model, it's a bit old, but I still like it because I think it captures the complexity of healthcare and what we need to address in terms of care provision. People have all got a whole range of physiology needs. And this always, I was teaching last week with some students, and they always say, what's sex on there for, Wilf? And I keep saying to them, well, if there isn't sex, we won't have a species. This is about the perpetuation of humanity. Safety, we all want to feel safe. It's about love and belonging. And because these elements influence who I am about myself, my self-esteem. And this is about reaching full potential, self-actualization. And somebody said the other month, Wilf, you need to add something else in that love and belonging. And I said to them, well, I pushed them a little bit. What should we add in there? Wi-Fi. And what was interesting, I typed in Google Maslow's hierarchy of need in Wi-Fi, and somebody had actually got this model and drawn another side on it and put Wi-Fi. Now, it seems ridiculous, doesn't it? It seems a bit farcical. But when you look at how people are connected now, most of us have got we're never disconnected from people. We have Facebook, we've got Twitter. It was interesting. I was laughing last night because Sarah said we're going to do some tweeting. We're connected everywhere in terms of how we connect. And what was interesting, two things. I was doing a dignity workshop in one of the trusts where I was working, and we had some of our patient advocacy liaison service who were the people who were trying to, if there are issues, trying to address those issues before they escalate. And the ladies had said to me, a couple of patients had come into the office saying they weren't going to come into hospital because they didn't have access to Wi-Fi. Now that again seems a bit ridiculous. If you've got a healthcare need, you should be accessing the appropriate service. But what they were saying is the only way they could connect to family who were lived away was through social media, was through Wi-Fi. And so it puts it into context. My son went travelling a couple of years ago, and the only way I could connect with him, he went off to Asia, down to Vietnam, over to Australia, lived there for 2 years. The only way I could connect with him was Skype, Facebook. So that's when it reinforced it for me. So back to this medical model then. How do we fit the spiritual when prevailing model of healthcare is curative? It's about treatment, intervention, it's about systems, it's about processes. And what I'm not going to do is stand here and denigrate the medical model of care. I'm not. Because I think there's a symbiosis needed. There's a symbiosis between this holistic approach and the medical approach. But sometimes we veer too much on the medical at the expense of this other important dimension. Because systems, the medical model is important. The fact that most of us are going to live into our 80s is in part down to this medical approach to care. So I said earlier, I'm at a stage in my life now where I'm reading a bit more, trying to anyhow. I've picked up a couple of books on spirituality. And what's interesting, trying to gain new insight into what these concepts tell us. These first two books are phenomenal in terms of the insight they provide and the understanding of the concept. I must confess, I've not bought the one at the far right yet. I've seen it in Waterstones a couple of times, and somebody said, Wilf, you're being prejudiced. You're looking at the title of the book and not at the cover and not at the content. I might pick it up, but I just seems to think it devalues a lot of what we've done over several years. But I might be rise to that challenge. One of the things I've been criticised for in my practice and my work on spirituality is I've never ever defined it, and that's deliberate. Up until 2009, when I gave my professorial, a trial run of my professorial lecture, and some colleagues in the audience said, you're going to have to define this thing. I said, I don't want to. You can't put it in a box. You can't put spirituality in a box and tick it. You need to define it. So what I did is I reflected on my life, on my experiences as a nurse, as a practitioner, as a researcher, as an educator, and I came up with this. For me, spirituality is intricately linked with dignity and compassion. It's that holistic approach. It's beyond intellect. We can be spiritual without intellect. And one of the areas I'm interested in also is how we care for people living with dementia. One of the things I've learned in my career and my life is you don't need to have an intellectual capacity to be a spiritual person. And what happens when that capacity is eroded through a degenerative condition like Alzheimer's or a dementia? Does that mean the person becomes less spiritual? I'd probably say it's the reverse. They become more spiritual. And one of the things I learned early on in my nursing career as a student was working with children with profound intellectual disability, intellectual cognitive impairment. And I learned more about spirituality without language, without words, than at any point in my career. So I'm really careful about how we use language in terms of how we describe this concept. I'm going to move on. There's been several definitions of spirituality provided, but you need to know about Elizabeth Weathers' definition. Cork's own Elizabeth Weathers, because she's produced this wonderful piece of work. And it's pretty clear from this, spirituality is about transcendence, it's about connection, it's about what gives life meaning and purpose, it's about relationships. Somebody said, how do you distinguish between these? Well, I don't need to, because somebody far greater than me has already done it. Harold Koenig in the States does an excellent compare and contrast between religion and spirituality. So you could argue briefly, religion is there's a bit more authority and a bit more narrowing in terms of its application, whereas spirituality is far more broader. I developed a taxonomy back in 2004, and there are different ways people approach spirituality. Spirituality is not static. I've been challenged for some of my writing by quite an eminent scholar on and he's contributed wonderfully to this debate on spirituality. But where him and I disagree, the way he writes sometimes assumes this concept is spirituality, and I disagree. It's not monolithic. It's not like our rock of Cashel here that probably doesn't change very little over time. Spirituality does. It evolves. We encounter situations that changes. So I say to the students when I'm teaching them, when I come and speak to you in 3 years' time or at another point in this program, you will have changed. Because life changes us, nursing, healthcare changes us as we encounter people in their vulnerability and their complexity. I'm going to push on. I was going to read a thing. So for me, there are probably five key elements to spirituality. First is this existential. We all need to find meaning and purpose in situations. It's about relationship and connection. It's this sense of something greater. Maybe for some people that will be a belief in God. For others, it won't be. It's about what gives their life meaning. Connections are important. I keep saying to my son and my family now, I keep saying to everybody, you're only as good as your network. And it's pretty true in terms of relationships. Networks are pretty important. And for some people, it will be a theistic approach. There will be a belief in God, however that God is expressed. And we shouldn't undermine that. The danger is we're trying to sanitize spirituality. We're trying to make it universal. We have this approach that it's about equal opportunity and it's about being politically correct. But there's a danger. We could remove a key element of this in order to make it universal. And then what we do is it isn't universal because what we created doesn't meet everybody. So for me, spirituality is absent when all of this is present. It devalues or diminishes the identity of a person. It leads to a violation in human dignity. It leads to intentional destruction of human life. And we see this on a daily basis, communities, societies, environments, our natural world. For me, what's happening, that isn't to do with spirituality, it's something else. There's other words you could use. And ideologies that are divisive, oppressive, disempowering, promote a propaganda that is insensitive about equality, diversity, doesn't uphold human rights. It's not spiritual. It's something else. There's other words I've written in the book chapter, but vile, diabolical. There's a whole range of words we could use. So just to conclude, if we're to be successful in recognizing the warp and weft of spirituality, then we must be aware of the warp and weft of spirituality within our own lives. This is, as the older I get, the more reflective I become, and I think that's the stage of where I am. But we need to be introspective. We need to look at what is my spirituality? How do I understand this concept? How might I recognise it in others? So we've just done this big European study with students, and one of the things is pretty clear. Those students who are reflective and aware of their own spirituality recognise it in other people. There's no question about that. We must acknowledge it's a multidimensional, it's subjective, it's complex. Just because it's complex doesn't mean to share we should shy away from it. It gives us a legitimacy to engage with it. And this dimension focuses our attention on the individual, the person, not just the medical condition and the treatment. This is about recognising the person at the centre of whether that's the patient, the member of the public we're serving, each other. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Wilf, for that wonderful presentation on the weaving of spirituality into healthcare. A couple of things that struck me, I suppose, was I was really taken by, and I was reassured actually, by that journey of transformation from psychogeriatric wards of 30 years ago to where we are now in terms of healthcare. So that was really reassuring. When you talked about putting the person at the centre, and I had a real strong sense of that tension that exists for all of us between the person-centred or the patient-centred and the professional-centred, and all of the other demands and the complex demands that draw us sometimes to become more professionally rather than person-centred. When you talked about the unique contribution, and I suppose the unique contribution of nurses in particular, what struck me was the extent to which perhaps we're lost in technology, we're lost in checks and balances, and we're lost in outcome measures. And I suppose the question that arises then is, if we are lost and if we have lost our way, how are we going to find it? Where are we going to find it? I was also interested, I suppose, and one of the things that struck me was that kind of, that again, that movement, kind of maybe movement in a genuine direction of moving away from buzzwords to really, really embracing the genuine human encounters at the core of all of this helping that we do. And I suppose I was getting very excited about the spirituality and the need for us to be explicit about it. But there was a word of caution, I suppose, in the sensitive ethical dimensions as well of spirituality, and the balance maybe in terms of how we present that, how we express that in our working lives. Thank you for giving us that deeper understanding of the spiritual and all of the inherent complexities that lie in it. So thank you, Will, for that very much. Now, I have a tendency to get it wrong on timing something. It is coffee break, Mary, isn't it? Yeah. So it is coffee break now, and we'll reconvene at 11 a.m. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay, so thank you, folks. Tea and coffee's outside, yes?